Well, when the school closed in May, and I'm almost certain it was May of 1970, I decided that I wasn't going back to Nashville. At this point, my parents were saying, well, when are you coming home? My father had gone out. When I graduated from Tennessee State, my father did one interesting thing. He says, I'm going to find you a job. I said, okay, Daddy. So my father went to his attorney. My father's attorney was Avon Williams, who was the noted civil rights attorney in Nashville. My grandfather's attorney was Z. Alexander Louie, also a civil rights attorney whose house had been bombed in Nashville in 1960-61 during the demonstrations. But it was sort of interesting. So he went to Mr. Williams, who at that point was a state senator, and he says, my daughter just graduated. We want to get a job for her. Well, the reason I ended up in Carbondale was the job that he offered my father. We've got social work jobs, and she'd be great. She's got this degree, and they pay $8,600 a year. I looked at my father. I said, you know what, Daddy? I got an offer to go to Carbondale to get more education so I can make more money. Neither he nor Mr. Williams were happy with me for a while. But he said, fine, if that's what you want to do. Now, it took a bit more convincing to get him to that level. But my mother said, look, she's grown, let her go. And she gets, she'll be fine. So in May of 1970, rather than going back home to be pushed into this $8,600 job, which he had gotten the year before from me, I decided to take a train to Chicago. My roommate was from Chicago, and we lived in a house off campus, and several friends. I said, I can go up there and work for a summer. Well, didn't find a job until August, and the job I found was teaching school. Something I didn't want to do. My mother always wanted me to be a teacher. I didn't want to do that. My mother had an 8th grade education, my father a 6th grade education. So she always wanted to be a teacher. I said, Mama, I don't want to teach nobody's children. So I ended up teaching for 2 years in Chicago. I taught in the original Cooley High School in the basement.
That they made the movie about?
That they made the movie about. In the basement. I lasted 45 days.
What happened?
Well, at some point, Cooley is located near Cabrini Green Housing Authority, and so I was sitting there. I was teaching there, but there was a lot of unrest because 2 police officers had been killed the August before school started in September. And it was a lot of unrest. And then I was in a basement classroom with 7th graders. And at lunchtime, the sport was to throw milk cartons through the 7th grade windows into the room, so you couldn't get anything done. So somewhere I decided this was not my cup of tea. It was too much stress and everything, so I left Cooley running the other way. that door that the guy comes out, I came out of that door and got down those stairs and headed out. But then I ended up teaching on the west side of Chicago. And the west side was very interesting. I taught reading for 5th and 6th graders. My girlfriend, my roommate's mother had worked for the Board of Education, so I was really able to get another assignment pretty quickly. But when I walked into the building, I didn't have a master's in reading. All I had was a belief that children could learn regardless of where they were. And I took what I had learned and what people thought of me into this situation. Well, the reading teacher had a master's. He had been in the system for 15 to 20 years. He was teaching syllables, verbs, and something else, and they weren't learning a thing. I decided, well, the best way to teach children how to read is to expose them to stuff and get them interested. On the west side of Chicago, you couldn't find a blade of grass anywhere on anybody's yard. It was a poor neighborhood. It was one of the poorest in the country. Arthington and Sacramento. And it was Bethune Elementary School. Well, Mary McLeod Bethune had taught black kids. I figured I could too. And she was pretty good at it. So I started taking them to places. I took them to the Morton's Arboretum so that they could see trees and get involved, and we went on this field trip. And the teacher and the guy said, well, why are you doing that? They're not going to learn anything. You don't know what you're doing. And he was not very nice to me at all. Now, he did call me a few names I didn't like. And I sort of looked at him. I said, well, at the end of the year, let's see who does what. Took them to, I also let them listen to the spoken word. And this is the spoken black word. Langston Hughes, the poems of County Cullen, all of these things I exposed them to. And he says, why are you doing that? They're not going to learn anything. And then we went to DuSable Museum when it was in Margaret Burroughs' basement.
And Margaret Burroughs
is the founder of DuSable Museum in Chicago. It is now a building in Washington Park. It's a huge building. Well, Margaret had taught my then boyfriend, then husband, now ex-husband in high school. So I knew Margaret. I knew her husband. They would go to Africa every year. So I took 25 kids from the West Side, and Margaret's husband was the docent for the day. He was the leader. He was talking about all of the artifacts they had in their basement. And when he got through, and he was talking about the artifacts, the kings, the princes, and the tribal customs in Africa, you could hear a pin drop with these little rowdy kids from the West Side who otherwise would not be quiet for anything. And you could see the lights come on. You could see the lights come on in their eyes. And at the end of the school year, what happened was I had these kids that couldn't learn anything. And when they retested them, all of the children went from 8 months to 8 years in terms of testing, in terms of learning. So we had students who had gotten so enthralled with things that they were doing their own research, they were doing that. So when they took their test, the post-test for reading, their scores had increased. And one kid was he was literally a pre-first grader when they tested him. So he was then testing about 8th, 9th grade level.
What was it inside of you that made you know that exposure and life experience would motivate these kids? Or were you just experimenting to see?
No. I always believe, and I still do believe, that people can learn if you just give them the right tools. And I knew that these children, if you just let them go, if you just believed in them, that they could do this. And that's really all I ever did. Was somebody said, well, what did you do? I said, I believe they could learn. When I started tapping the veins and the lights started coming on, I knew that was it. That's how I had been taught. So I'm taking a tool that was as old as I was at the time, and I was in my 20s, but it was sort of like, okay, I listened to the spoken word. I lived in the country, so we did a lot of science projects about what trees and things were, so that's why I took them to the Arboretum. So I'm taking a tool that had taught me how to read, that had taught me how to research, how to be curious, how to reach out and learn things. So that was something that I took, and it worked,